Thanks very much for the organizers of this important symposium. I think that we all have to work harder to get people together across the traditional disciplinary boundaries if we're going to understand what's happening on Earth today. And so as Sarah has introduced the idea of what makes an Earth habitable, and I'm really going to discuss what makes it uninhabitable. And so let me just start by saying, trilobites, that's what I'm going to be talking about in part. All right, so let me start with an overview of Earth's oxygen in its atmosphere from 4 billion years ago to the present. This is from a review paper from 2014. And of course, for the first 2.5 billion years, Earth had very little oxygen, and then there was a rise, and then about 700 million years ago, there was another rise to approximately our current number. And the point I really want to make with this image is to reiterate what Marcia McNutt said, which is that no matter what happens to our atmosphere and our climate, the Earth is going to be fine. It's humans who are in trouble. Because with each of these atmospheric changes, there have been creatures that have benefited and creatures that have been driven extinct. And we tend to think of the rise of oxygen as a good thing, right? This is photosynthesis, and these are the things that make our life exciting in the world that we know. But of course, there were a lot of creatures that found that oxygen was a tremendous poison, and were driven into little tiny refugia through our Earth. And so recall that these big swings are good for some and bad for others. And that's really, I think, the lesson. We have the challenge as Earth and planetary scientists that doing double-blind, replicable experiments is very difficult. We've got one Earth, and we're looking at it at one point in time. And so what I want to spend the rest of the talk here telling you about is the results of a study that we've been working on for 6 or 7 years, I guess, about the end Permian extinction and the Siberian flood basalts. And so as David referred to understand things in the past, further back than the ice cores, we have to go to the rock record. And so I'm going to tell you a story of interrogating the rock record to understand a period of time that Jeff Keel at the National Centers for Atmospheric Research said was the time most similar to the present day in Earth history. And it was exceptionally catastrophic and therefore very, very interesting, I think. So let's talk about the end Permian extinction 252 million years ago. So this extinction is recorded in ocean sediments, and so we tend to think of it as an extinction of oceanic microorganisms. And so it's good to remember that there were some more charismatic, gigantic creatures. Imagine a crinoid 40 meters long. End of the crinoids. It was the end of a lot of the lystrosaurs. And it was the end of the eurypterids. Can you imagine a 2.5 meter eurypterid? Someone once said to me, that takes a lot of butter and lemon. And so what are the ways that we know that a global extinction can occur? This extinction was something above 90% of species in the oceans died, and something above 70% of species on land died. This was a really catastrophic event. It was the end of many things, and then the beginning of many more things. Well, we know it wasn't nuclear war, and the other common cause of extinctions in the rock record would be meteoroid impact. And as much as many scientists have searched the world around for evidence of meteoroid impact at this moment, that really appears not to have been the cause. And so we're left with the thought that it could have been volcanism. This is a Google Maps image of Asia from from Scandinavia on the top left to the Kamchatka Peninsula on the right. And you can just see the tip of Lake Baikal in the center bottom of the screen, and the Taimyr Peninsula at the top, where I've been fortunate to have some adventures. Let me see if I can find this button. No. Where's the button on this? Oh, there, I got it. Thank you. So Taimyr Peninsula. So this purple region is where the Siberian flood basalts, this giant volcanic event that happened at that time, is bedrock. So if you can burrow through the sphagnum moss, the first thing you encounter is the Siberian flood basalts. And the white region is where you have to actually dig through younger rocks to get to the Siberian flood basalts, but they're shown in drill cores. So this was a huge event. And you might right away say, well, of course then it was the volcanoes. How could this not cause a global extinction? But the thing is that most of the lavas that have been studied from this event are calm, effusive lavas like Hawaii. In Hawaii, you can walk up to the lava, you can stand right by and admire it, you can go home, you haven't died. The Hawaiian Islands are, well populated. And so the thought was that these kinds of plateau lavas that occur in Siberia do not carry significant volatile loads. They could not have changed the climate. And so we went out to try to test that. And just to give you a sense of the volume, I've taken the effusive, the extrusive volumes of a lot of different volcanic events and shown them here, starting with tiny little Mount St. Helens that for many of us was a huge event. It's a tiny event, tiny event. Iceland in 1783, the Laki eruptions, which caused tens of thousands of people to die from starvation. Both from cooling from sulfur in the northern hemisphere over a number of seasons, and also from direct vegetation kill by hydrofluoric acid. And so I hope that many of you know about hydrofluoric acid. At least at the time, upon one of the times that I was at MIT, that was the only chemical that had its very own safety course. And this was naturally occurring, and I'm going to come back to hydrofluoric acid. And then up through the big Yellowstone eruptions that many people are fond of making us afraid of, the next one coming along. And so here's how that compares to the Siberian flood basalts. And so again, right away, you'd say, well, of course the volcanoes caused the extinctions, but you have to show that they carried climate-changing chemicals, and you have to show that they can eject them into the atmosphere. And this was not a foregone conclusion. And so we took 5 or 6, I can't remember now, expeditions to Siberia to get samples of the rocks that we could interrogate. Sam Bowring and Brad Hager and myself on the right, and Ben Black, who was our graduate student, who's now a postdoc at Berkeley, and then 2 of our Russian friends, Anya and Roma Veselovsky from the Moscow State University, and then John Rubin, and I've just blanked out on his name, great guy, filmmakers. That's taken way up north in Siberia. So here we are on the Kotoy River collecting samples, and here we are collecting samples at the base of the lavas. You just have to put in a few of these pictures when you're talking about this. Looking back down at the Kotoy River from where we were taking samples. And then, so here's the punchline. I'm going to tell you right now, so you're kind of prepared for the data in a moment. Where did these magmas get these climate-changing chemicals? They got them from the bedrock that they were chambered in. So it turns out that these magmas came up from the mantle with very little, and then they were chambered inside of a 12-kilometer deep basin that first contained what are called evaporites, the results of drying out an inland ocean. So you get limestone, you get gypsum, you get everything that's in seawater, only in rock form, topped with one of the biggest coal basins in the world. And that's where these magmas were chambered. And you know what else was in that evaporite basin, even at this time, was hydrocarbons. And so this is, Mother Nature burning hydrocarbons to change the climate, only 252 million years ago. And so here's some low-grade coal on the right and some lava on the left. And then this is a cliff of gypsum, which is very enriched in sulfur, and sulfur becomes a big part of this story. Here's another picture of that cliff. This is Seth Burgess, who did the geochronology on this project with limestone up to just over his head, and above that about 100 meters of gypsum. This is an exceptional basin to go through, it really is. And so the other part of the story is, it turns out these were not all calm, effusive lavas like Hawaii normally is. There have been sort of rumors of explosive volcanism like Toba, like Pinatubo, like Mount St. Helens, but it had never been really explored by geologists or published about. And in fact, in 2015, we published the first major survey of these rocks in the English language. Here's a cliff that is 100% produced by explosive eruptions. There's a huge amount of explosive rock that underlies the lavas that came first. Here's Ben Black next to some of these explosive results with some specular sandstone that's been driven up from well underground. And here's the same thing with a bit of coal, big lump of coal that was drawn up from underground. And this is a little unpublished result I wanted to share with you today. Some years ago, some scientists from the Canadian Geological Society found in some of the Arctic islands of Canada bits of burnt coal that look like this, coal fly ash. And they posited, they were at the right age to be the end Permian, and they posited these came from coal burning from the Siberian flood basalts that were carried around by polar wind currents and deposited in Canada. And so we spent an awful lot of time looking for places that the magmas really interacted with these coals. And in the north, we found there was really almost no evidence for interaction. The coals are right at the surface, the lava is just coming out on top, and there isn't a lot of hanging around with the coal. But in the south, which is where most of these explosive rocks are. We brought samples of that home, and we sent them up to these guys in the Geological Survey in Canada, and they found many, many examples of identical coal ash. So it seems like burning coal was part of the explosive volcanism in the south. And of the very, very large amount of rocks that were produced there, some of them are reworked, and some of them were for calmer eruptions, just where magmas went into lakes. But the ones where we have evidence for hot explosive volcanism total something like 10,000 cubic kilometers, which is 10 times bigger than a Yellowstone eruption. So this was a huge event with huge climate changing possibilities. And so this is the way our project laid out. We did the geochronology. This was done by Sam Bowering and Seth Burgess. This was his PhD thesis, and they have absolutely proven with the world's highest precision that about 70 to 80% of the volcanic rocks were erupted, and then the extinction happened, and then the volcanism continued. And so we now know without a doubt that temporally the extinction is in the right place to be caused by the rocks. Now, proving that the volcanoes caused the eruption is a more complicated process. And so I'll just show you quickly some volatile measurements we've taken by interrogating those rocks and what happens when you put them into climate models. And so on the vertical axis here is sulfur. And the data is from all over the Siberian flood basalt. So this is Ben Black's work, part of his thesis. And those three horizontal lines, the top one is the largest amount of sulfur found in the Columbia River flood basalts. The middle one is from Laki, that caused death by famine because of crop failure. And the bottom one is from the Deccan traps, is another similar kind of flood basalt. So a lot of sulfur, and we'll talk about acid rain from sulfur in a moment. A lot of chlorine, up to a weight % of chlorine, the same horizontal lines at the bottom. So this is coming straight from that evaporite basin being incorporated into the magmas and erupted. And fluorine, my favorite, as much as 2 weight % of fluorine in these rocks. And so what happens when you take chlorine and fluorine and carbon and you put it into a hot eruptive plume? Well, this was first posited by Sverre Planka and Henrik Svensson at the University of Oslo. You get halocarbons. You get naturally occurring chlorofluorocarbons, which is something that never occurred to me could happen. And yet it did happen. They've demonstrated that through lab experiments and by baking the sedimentary rocks. And we've shown here that it was actually erupted out of the volcanoes as well. So 2 pieces of modeling to show you. So this is with the National Center for Atmospheric Research's 252-million-year-old model of that time. There's the time of Pangaea. So you're seeing a map of the world here with the outlines of Pangaea and the ocean in the middle. And so you can't really model the whole event, which is over 1 million years. And so this is from one sill emplacement, one lava flow, or one of the explosive eruptions only. And it brings the pH of rain in the northern hemisphere down below 3, where 5 is the pre-industrial average. And so all through the northern hemisphere oceans, and you can see exactly where the flood basalts were right there, still 60 degrees north, the same as today. And these stars, by the way, are where examples of mutated pollen grains have been found at that time, which is thought to be caused by ozone loss, which is the next slide. But if you get down below a pH of 3, you're killing amphibians and fish, and you're really damaging plants. And so this is highly coincident with the idea of an extinction being caused, but it's hard to prove that last mile. And so this is ozone. And so this is from the CH3Cl released in the lower troposphere, again from just one eruptive event, not the whole flood basalts. And you see it takes the entire world down below 140 Dobson units. Now that's about the lowest ozone measured in the southern hemisphere ozone hole in the present era. So it takes the whole Earth down well below that for as long as 10 years at a time from each one of these eruptions. So it's very tempting to say, this is it. this kind of global climate change, which we have demonstrated these flood basalts could cause, is what caused the end Permian extinction, this huge extinction of multicellular life everywhere. Maybe the worst thing since the rise of oxygen for creatures that were happy on Earth. But just as you saw with the earlier talks, and we'll hear later today, connecting that last kilometer is really complicated. Proving that this is actually what caused things to die is incredibly difficult, particularly back in the rock record where we have relatively little information about land creatures. So we've taken this about as far as we know how to right now. I think we've taken it big strides past where it's been before. And I would posit that the kind of catastrophe that happened at that time is, in fact, very similar to the kind of catastrophe we're creating today. And the lesson is life is going to be fine, but I think that we've got some work to do to maintain our quality of life. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda. Questions for Lindy? Fascinating detective story about all the extinctions, but please.
Can you quantify that last point? In other words, what can we say anything about the volume of the gases versus if we sort of burn all the coal and oil and natural gas, for example?
Yeah, the question is, the question is, can we quantify the gas release from the Siberian flood basalts and compare it to what humankind is doing today? And yes, we can do that. You know, we've made estimates of what each individual lava flow might have produced. I don't have those numbers, unfortunately, to recite to you. But the big question is, small perturbations, a single lava flow, bad news, right? 10 years of ozone loss. What's the effect on the creatures, those that have quick reproduction or slow reproduction or live under the water, over the water? And then when you try to integrate over the whole flood basalt province, it's not a good comparison today, because today we are continually pumping out high levels of these gases. And for the flood basalts, it was a pulsed event, which should have actually less effect than a continuous event like the one that we're causing today.
Rob?
So any speculation what would cause this incredibly anomalous volcanic event?
Any speculation about what would cause the volcanic event? Yeah, since I started studying this problem as a graduate student in EAPS with Tim Grove and Brad Hager, looking at it from a geodynamic point of view. And these great big periodic flood basalts are the best thing that we posit is that they come from hot plumes inside the mantle, and now there's increasing geophysical evidence being able to actually image these hot plumes coming up underneath Iceland, for example. In a fluid dynamic sense, it's easy to imagine. You've got a bottom boundary layer against the core where heat is being conducted outward, and that bottom boundary layer is perturbed and in a fluid dynamical sense goes unstable, and it rises through the otherwise slightly cooler mantle as a thermal anomaly, and then it melts when it gets close to the surface. And the thing that we've really added to that story is that likely destabilizes the bottom of the plate, and causes it to drip off, which both increases the rate of melting and causes it to burst. So you get, burst in terms of high output lavas, and also helps to shut it off, because these flood basalt events all seem to take about 1 million years from start to finish, and exactly why they start and exactly why they finish remains a bit of a mystery. So we've been trying to add to that through these kinds of geodynamical models.
One more question.
What's the overall effect on temperature of these events? It seems like the dust would actually cool things, but then the gases would have a warming effect at the same time.
Right. What's the overall temperature effect is the question. And so I believe it was Wignall who recently published some results on the temperature rise at the end Permian. We don't have great proxies for temperature back then. And so although we can pull temperature out of these NCAR models, we don't feel very confident about them because indeed the sulfur creates aerosols which produces cooling and the ash produces cooling. There's so much interesting work to be done on this ash, which we have a lot of samples of. And then presumably the CO2 and also of course the chlorofluorocarbons are tremendous greenhouse gases, super effective. And so it's a competition. And also through time, it appears that the Siberian flood basalts were emitting different kinds of gases. And so that's going to also cause that competition to change over the time of the eruption. Stay tuned, we're doing more work on that. And an interesting thing is, I didn't talk very much about carbon here. I mentioned the coal, the hydrocarbons. But an interesting thing we've found is that in the little melt inclusions, the tiny droplets of trapped magma inside crystals that we use to get these measurements, very many of them are supersaturated in carbon, such that we're confused about how that could happen. And so we haven't published on the carbon story yet, but the carbon story could be gigantic.
Thank you, Lindy.
Thanks very much.
It brings us right back in time. Thank you very much.